I want to welcome everyone to today's Financial Issues Forum. Momentarily, I will conduct a fireside chat with Edwin. It's Edward, right? I wrote this wrong. A student of mine's named Edward. I apologize. Edward Fishman, as we discuss his book, Choke Points, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. My name is Paul Johnson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Gabelli Center for Global Security Analysis at Fordham University. The Financial Issues Forum is a collaboration of three partners: the Museum of American Finance, the CFA Society of New York, and the Gabelli Center. Our goal is to bring renowned experts from different fields to speak on topics and issues that are relevant to the economy, to the market, and to you. The fireside chat will last for about 40 minutes, at which point our speaker will address questions submitted through the question field that is located below your video player. Please feel free to submit questions at any point during our event. We will address as many of them as possible during the session. Following the discussion, I will be joined by David Cowan, President and CEO of the Museum of American Finance, to field the questions from the audience. All attendees today will be receiving digital copies of the book, Choke Points, with information coming following our event. Let me introduce our speaker. Edward Fishman is a leading authority on economic statecraft and sanction. He teaches at Columbia University School of International Public Affairs, generally known as CIPA, and is a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Previously, Edward served at the U.S. State Department as a member of the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Staff, at the Pentagon as an advisor to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and at the U.S. Treasury Department as Special Assistant to the Undersecretary of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. His writing and analysis are regularly featured by outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, Politico, and NPR. All right, Eddie, let's get started. Eddie, welcome.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to be here today.
Well, I'm gonna confess something at the very beginning. I love this book. I knew some of the history, but you do a fabulous job of creating really a weave through all of the events of the last, well, in some ways, 100 years, but certainly the last 50 years. So my first question to you is, what motivated you to write this? I thank you, but what motivated you to write this book?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Paul, thank you so much for your comments about my book, and thank you for having me here at the Financial Issues Forum. This is a really great series, and I'm honored to be a part of it. So, really, my motivation for writing Choke Points goes back to my own experience working on issues like sanctions and economic statecraft in the U.S. government. So, I was lucky enough to work on the sanctions campaign that the US put in place on Iran in advance of the nuclear deal that was first signed in 2013 and then expanded into a comprehensive agreement in 2015. And I was also the Russia and Europe sanctions lead at the State Department after Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time in 2014 and annexed Crimea. And I remember, Paul, the discussions we would have in the Situation Room after Russia first annexed Crimea in 2014. And we would talk about things like whether we should arm the Ukrainians, giving the Ukrainians javelins, for instance, which ultimately President Obama decided not to do. And when we would have these discussions, everyone around the table would have a really strong opinion, whether it was the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA, the State Department. It was a really lively discussion. But then when topics of like sanctions came up, which wound up being a very important, actually the principal tool we used against Russia in 2014, the room would be much more quiet. And often you would only have one or two people, often from the Treasury Department, who would feel confident enough to weigh in on these issues. And it struck me that despite the fact that tools like sanctions and tariffs and export controls have become the principal way that the United States and other great powers compete with one another, our national level understanding and dialogue of these topics is very, very low. And this isn't just sort of in the public domain, but even in places like the Situation Room, even in Washington, D.C. And so After I left government, I really committed myself to try to find ways to elevate that discussion. And so I started teaching my class at SIPA at Columbia, which I've now done for the last half decade. And I'm lucky enough that many of my students have gone on to work in places like the State Department and Treasury Department. But it was actually during the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, when I was actually teaching that spring, that the students in my seminar, it's a relatively small class, I cap it at 20 students every year, said, Professor Fishman, this is not fair. Why we shouldn't be the only ones who get access to this. You need to find a way to bring this to a larger group. And so that's actually what inspired me, is my students to write this book, Choke Points. And so my biggest objective, Paul, in putting this book out there, and really a big reason why I did write it as an accessible narrative history that I think isn't something that's only of interest to intense policy wonks, but really anyone in the general public could pick it up, I think, and find value in it, is that I do think it's critical for us to elevate our national understanding and dialogue on economic warfare.
All right, so I want to, this is great. This is great. I did not know that part of the story, so that's extremely helpful. I do want to do a little bit of definitions, just so people understand when you say sanctions, when we say tariffs, when we say economic statecraft. I just want to put a little bit of words around that so people understand the difference, because tomorrow's Liberation Day and we're going to have tariffs, but tariffs and sanctions are different. So can you walk me through kind of those key variables, the key definitions?
Yeah, sure. Maybe we'll start from the broadest, and then we'll go narrower. So There's a term that sometimes people hear called economic statecraft. What economic statecraft is, it's the use of economic tools to advance foreign policy objectives. So economic statecraft includes sanctions, tariffs, export controls, but it also includes things like trade agreements or foreign aid, or really the whole broad array of economic tools that you may use, both as carrots and as sticks, right? Economic warfare is a subset of economic statecraft, which really is the more coercive side. It's when you're cutting off economic activity or restricting economic activity to try to advance a broader strategic objective. So sanctions, I think, are the classic use of economic warfare. Within economic warfare, there are various tools that the United States can use, right? The same way that when you're fighting a military campaign, you have air power, you have sea power. There are different weapons you bring to that contest. In economic warfare, sanctions, and in particular financial sanctions, are the most impactful and powerful tool the U.S. has. And that's because the dollar, and I'm sure this is something we'll talk about throughout our conversation today, is the most important choke point in the global economy, the most important sort of resource where one state, in this case the United States, has a dominant position, and there are few, if any, really alternatives. And what that means is, because the dollar has that position, the U.S. can cut off foreign countries and foreign companies in particular from accessing the dollar-based financial system and impose really significant economic pressure and pain on them. You can also, use sanctions to cut off all trade. So an embargo is a form of sanctions, right? Where, you could say we're not going to import any oil from Russia at all. Generally speaking, sanctions are a much stronger and more sort of restrictive tool than a tariff. A tariff is a tax on imports. So to bring that back, that example of Russian oil, if you were to put an embargo on Russian oil, which the U.S. did do in March of 2022, it means that it is illegal for American companies to buy any Russian oil. You cannot buy any of it, right? If a refinery in Louisiana tried to buy a cargo of Russian oil, they'd be violating American law. They'd be criminally liable, right? And their executives may be liable too. If you put let's say a 25% tariff on Russian oil, it would be legal, fully legal, to buy the Russian oil. It would just cost the buyer, in this case a refinery in the U.S., 25% on top of whatever the price was that they paid the Russian counterparty. So generally speaking, when you're thinking about tariffs and sanctions as tools of economic warfare, and tariffs in particular can also be used just as a regular tool of domestic economic policy, sanctions are a much more powerful tool, much, much more powerful. And I actually think this is something that President Donald Trump does not understand, where he has talked about tariffs as this magic bullet that not only is great for protecting domestic industries like the steel sector from foreign competition, or maybe even raising revenue, but also basically coercing foreign countries to do whatever he wants them to do. But in that respect, tariffs are actually a much weaker tool than sanctions.
right. So now I was going to come to this later, but I think we need to do it now. Let's talk a little bit about the dollar. As you say in the book, you said right now, and anybody who's kind of studied this, the dollar is the dominant trade currency. We probably could spend an hour on what a currency is, but it's the exchange protocol on the planet. And the example you gave in the book that I thought was just really beautiful is if I'm a smaller country and I want to trade with another country, unless I really have a lot of trade, I may not have access to that. I mean, I have access to that currency, but it may not be a liquid exchange. And so the country will trade into the most popular currency and then trade into that other currency. And that currency is dollar. All right, let's talk a little bit about, why don't we work backwards? How much trade is done in dollars? What kind of commodities are done in dollars? How dominant is the dollar in international trade?
Yeah, sure. And I'm glad you're bringing up the dollar as a trade currency because oftentimes when you hear people talk in shorthand about the dollar's role, they'll say the dollar is the world's reserve currency. And that is true, right? It's something like 60% of foreign exchange reserves are in dollars. And certainly the dollar is the world's most preeminent store of value, right? And it's not just in terms of foreign exchange reserves. If you look at the market capitalization of American equities markets or the bond market, in many cases, they're half of the total value of the global market, right? So we are by far the most attractive destination for investment. But when it comes to sanctions, that is an important role because if you can't invest in the U.S. or if you have investments in the U.S. and are frozen, that can be harmful. But I think even more important is this sort of medium of exchange role that you're talking about right there, Paul, which is that basically if you're trying to settle a cross-border payment, you really do oftentimes need to use the dollar, even if there's no U.S. company on either side. And if you just think about it, I know you mentioned this a little bit, but I'll just give a more concrete example just so folks are staying with us. Like if you envision a Saudi Arabian company importing rice from India, a Saudi bank is not going to hold rupees, and an Indian bank is not going to hold reals. Generally speaking, banks around the world will only hold stores of two currencies, really. It's their own currency and then the dollar. And so if they're going to make a foreign exchange transaction, they're really going to, what's actually happening sort of beneath the hood is you're taking your domestic currency, exchanging it for dollars, and then taking the dollar and exchanging it for the foreign currency. And that's why I think probably the best statistic on the dollar's global role in the single biggest financial market of them all, which is the foreign exchange market, something like $7 trillion in turnover every day, 90% of all foreign exchange transactions have the dollar on one side of it. So the dollar is being used, much more than it would if it were just being, a currency that was being used for U.S. exports, right? Because you compare it to U.S. exports, it's something like 5 to 10%, I think, of global trade, right? So closer to 5%. So it's way out of proportion to what it would just be if the U.S. was trading. It was all in trading in dollars. And when you talk about commodities, I mean, most commodities are priced in dollars. I think the most important one though is oil, right? The petrodollar, and this is something I explore in choke points in quite some depth because it's a very important sort of foundation, I think, of the dollarized global economy.
Eddie, freeze for a second. I'm going to go right there next, but I want to stop and just I want to go back to one point you made and just make sure there is often a disconnect in the policy discussion, in economic discussion on TV among people that, as you said, often people will quote the dollar as the reserve currency, not necessarily knowing what that means, but they know it's important. But this point of it being an intermediate currency in trade having nothing to do with America outside is something that people don't understand. I think, and this is where we're going to go next. I think that people assume it's just because we're the biggest economy and we were the most stable economy coming out of World War II, so it became the trade. And I think you're about to tell a story that wasn't a guarantee coming out of World War II. So I just wanted to add that little connection. Now go with the petrodollar story, please.
Yes, no, I'm really glad you brought that up, and I will get to the petrodollar story. But I want to give you one piece of context before that, if it's okay, which is
please
that the U.S. role in the global economy, like as a share of the global economy, actually peaks right after World War II, and has been declines to something like I think we're almost 50% of GDP around the end of World War II. And by the 70s, we're like 25%. And that's roughly where we still are today, right? So it's actually been quite resilient since the 70s. But there's a big decline from 1945 to the early 70s. And the thing that's interesting too is if you look at what happens in the early 70s, you have Nixon who takes the US unilaterally off of the gold standard, right? Or the dollar gold link, where Bretton Woods had enshrined the dollar as convertible for $35 per ounce of gold. And at the time, this is done under duress, right? It's because there's effectively a run on the dollar, right? It's other countries, including America's biggest allies like the UK and France, lose confidence in the dollar because we don't have enough gold, basically, to back up that fixed exchange rate that Bretton Woods put in place. And so when this happens,
not to interrupt, but at World War II, we had 4 times as much gold as U.S. currency, and by 1970, we had 10%.
Right, it's quite a dramatic
currency
decline
in gold. So it dropped only by 40-fold. Okay.
Yeah, it dropped quite a bit, and the U.S. economy overall is just not doing very well. Right, we're running big deficits for the first time. We lose our role in the global oil market. There's this 1973 oil embargo in the U.S. that is very bad for everyone. And the reason I'm bringing this all up is, like, if you look at, from the perspective of Americans in the early 1970s, it was like we're a declining power, and our best days as an economic power, at the very least, are behind us decisively, right? And there really wasn't a debate. The thing that's fascinating, though, is that as the U.S.'s role in global trade declines, really, from the 1970s onward, its role in the global financial sector explodes, right? And so you don't actually have like a financialized global economy until you have the Nixon shock of August of 1971. The petrodollar, I think, is in some ways...
Wait. You missed the point. Pete, when he does that, the world is convinced that it's all over. I mean,
totally. Yeah,
when he takes us off it's really the fixed exchangeability. People often say, oh, he took us off the gold standard. He took us off the fixed price.
The fixed exchange.
I mean, you can still buy gold. Even the next day, you can buy gold. It's just the fixed price. He does that. Right. I've gone back and read this. It's just crazy. It's over. It's over. When he does this, it's over.
Yeah, it was a big shock, I think, and a real sign that America was a declining economic power. And this happens, by the way, in 1971. In 1973, you have the Arab oil embargo, which spikes oil prices in the United States. You have gasoline shortages, gas lines in the U.S. This is when stagflation becomes a noun that then unfortunately pervades that entire decade. And I think the most pressing crisis that the U.S. is facing going into 1974 is the fact that we have these enormous deficits that we're starting to run. And we're not sure that there's actually demand for dollars anymore, right? Because our role sort of in the dollar's role in the center of the world economy has been kind of broken because we no longer are going to back the dollar with gold at this defensible price that was enshrined at Bretton Woods. And so, the Nixon administration is basically faced with this question of what do we do? Like, do they dramatically raise taxes? Do they dramatically cut spending? And it is at that moment that the U.S. Treasury Secretary, who's a former bond trader, actually named Bill Simon, comes up with this idea where he realizes that the U.S. is paying a huge amount of money every single day to the Saudis for their oil exports and to other countries, but primarily the Saudi government. And what if the Saudis took the money that the U.S. was paying them and just reinvested it in U.S. treasuries, basically recycled the dollars into U.S. government debt? He actually gets on a plane in July of 1974, going to Jeddah. On that plane ride, by all accounts, there are a few people with him. He drinks copious amounts of whiskey. So he goes into this as only a bond trader would, I guess, feeling very jazzed up to talk to the Saudi royals about this deal. And
who don't drink, by the way, who don't drink.
Yeah, which is fascinating, right? And he's a chain-smoking New Jersey native, right. And he walks into Jeddah and he cuts this deal where the Saudis agree to A, keep pricing oil in dollars, B, take their oil funds and recycle them into U.S. government debt. And you ask, well, what do the Saudis get in return? We weren't bullying the Saudis to do this. We actually offered them carrots. It was a carrot approach instead of a stick approach. The carrot, there are two of them. One was that the Saudis got to buy U.S. government debt outside of the normal auctions, so they didn't have to participate competitively with others, and they could actually buy this debt in secret so that there was no public record of it or anything. They didn't necessarily have to face the opprobrium of their people who are quite anti-American in the wake of the Yom Kippur War. And additionally, the U.S. agreed to provide military aid to Saudi Arabia. So in some ways, it was like wielding both economic and military incentives to get this link between the most important commodity in the world, which is oil, and the dollar. And that really winds up being the linchpin of this new dollarized global financial system.
Now, freeze for a second. You and I were talking yesterday. So, just for a moment, this is the fun part. What if Bill Simon had failed?
Yeah, I think if Bill Simon had failed and we didn't have this unusual, exorbitant privilege, I think, where the dollar, there's demand for dollars irrespective of American exports, we would be a normal country. We wouldn't be able to run trillions and trillions of dollars of deficits every year, right? We'd either have to have much higher taxes, which, by the way, if you look at other, pure countries, industrialized democracies, they all have much higher taxes than we do. Although,
wait, don't say that. Americans want to believe we pay the most taxes.
Look, I live in New York. I've got children. I wish I paid lower taxes, but if you look at the tax rate in France, your heart will start to raise a little bit, right? You'd either have to have much higher taxes or much lower spending, right? So significant curtailments of defense spending, entitlements, et cetera. America would be a normal country, basically.
Oh, you say that. Oh.
Heaven forbid.
I know. All right, so we've essentially quickly established now the dollar becomes incredibly important in the global financial market. Reserve currency aside, it just becomes the medium of exchange for many transactions. Oil, wheat, most commodities are priced in dollars. It's very liquid. It's a safe transaction in a transactional sense. We could worry about inflation in a separate question if we need to. All right, now we can go to sanctions, and because we have the dollar, the dollar has this unique position in the financial. It becomes a tool, and in your professional career, it goes from maybe to now a part of the arsenal, a regular part of the arsenal. Talk a little bit about that evolution.
Yeah, so the ability to weaponize the dollar really exists from the get-go. I think it becomes more significant as the world becomes dollarized in the 70s and 80s, but really comes into view for the first time in the 90s. And that's because even in the 70s and 80s, it's really primarily other advanced industrialized democracies that are part of this dollar-based system. And so sure, if the US wanted to do big financial sanctions against Europe in the 70s or Japan in the 80s, we could have, but that was never a serious consideration because these were our allies, right? In the 90s is when you get China and Russia and the rest of the former communist bloc enter the global economy and the global financial system. And so it's really only after the world becomes dollarized, right? Globalization isn't actually global until the 90s, right? It's more like, regionalization or something like that. It's only then where you do have this power where you could say, wow, we could cut off a foreign company from this dollar and impose really significant pain on them. Of course, in the 90s, we didn't want to do this because we viewed the Russias and Chinas of the world more as potential friends than rivals, right? And in fact, US economic statecraft was geared not toward pressuring China and Russia, but actually encouraging them and building them into the global economic order, right? I mean, there's a huge amount of time, resources put into foreign assistance to Russia to bring Russia and China into the World Trade Organization, to get American banks to provide financing to Russian and Chinese companies. I mean, some of the biggest banks here in New York, where I live, they really helped the Russian and Chinese economies emerge in the 90s and 2000s, right? I mean, Goldman Sachs and
But Eddie, part of that is because the belief is if they become part of the Western trading, then capitalism goes first and democracy comes second, right? It wasn't just we're just
That's
trying
exactly
to help
right.
these countries. We thought bring them in and they will then see the benefits of being part of the West, and some of the other things go away.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's right. I think that it was a well-intentioned effort. The U.S. also really was quite it was the reason we called it sort of the unipolar moment, right? I mean, the discrepancy in power between the U.S. and every other country in the 90s was just dramatic, right? So, we didn't have much to fear at the time. I think what happened, though, unfortunately, Paul, is over the course of the 2000s and really in the 2010s is when China, Russia, and some of these other emerging countries start actually trying to get what they want in contravention of U.S. interests, right? And so you start realizing, oh wait, China is not necessarily our friend; they might be our enemy. Russia certainly declares itself as an enemy, probably first in 2008 when they invade Georgia, but then really, really clearly, when I was involved in 2014 when they invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea. And so it's at that point where we realize that, oh man, we have these problems with Russia and China. We really don't want to fight Russia and China, right? We don't want to go to war with them because they're nuclear powers, and it would be very bad for us to fight them militarily. But they are reliant on our financial system. And so all of a sudden, something that we had brought them into really to try to get their economies to grow, to try to encourage democratic and liberal reform, winds up becoming a weapon to be used against China and Russia.
All right. We start using these tools. It's interesting because if you go back to the 90s when we tried to integrate economically with China and Russia with the thought that they would then have such a vested interest in being part of the international trade system that these wars would kind of go away because they'd realize that this was bad for them. And now it's been postulated that perhaps if we go back and do business with Russia, we'll bring them into the fold, and guess what? They'll see the woes of their ways, and they'll love capitalism. And history is not on the side. It could work, but it's not on the side of that argument. All right, as I read your book and I think about the growing financial power that the U.S. has, I can't help but either, the analogy is either, predator and prey or virus and antivirus, which is the symbiotic relationship you have. And in a predator-prey, the prey continues to evolve to get out from under the predator. Or in a antivirus world, the virus mutates. So Russia and China are not stupid. And they see the power that the U.S. has, maybe historical accident, maybe whatever reason, but it is fact. They're not sitting still. So what are they thinking as we flex our muscles?
Yeah. So look, I think this is and actually Bob Rubin, the Treasury Secretary in the 90s, and I have a scene of him in the book when he sort of realizes that we do have these weapons for the first time, and he doesn't think it's a good idea to use these types of weapons in the 90s. And I think it's because his view is, once you sort of do it once you show yourself to be a potential threat, then you can never take that back, right? You can't make the target of this weaponization of finance unsee what they had just seen. And so I think the big turning point comes really in the period from 2012 to 2014, because that's when in 2012, the US imposes really dramatic financial sanctions on Iranian oil that successfully cut Iran's oil exports by about 60% and lock up nearly $100 billion of Iran's oil proceeds in foreign bank accounts. And then after 2014, when the US actually and the Europeans also imposed financial sanctions on Russia and cut the biggest Russian banks and state-owned enterprises off from Western capital markets, it becomes very clear to any country that may be eventually a target of the United States that they need an insurance policy. They need something else that they can go to in the event that they are cut off from the dollar. And so it's in 2014 that Russia starts developing what they call SPFS, which is their alternative to SWIFT, the Brussels-based financial messaging system, which kind of is a very core part of the infrastructure of the dollar-based financial system. It's also at that time that they pass a law that requires payments processors and credit card companies like Visa and MasterCard to process all of their transactions, their domestic Russian transactions, in Russia, at a payment center in Russia. And this actually winds up being very important because in 2022, when the US and the G7 dramatically expand sanctions on Russia, Visa and MasterCard pull out of the country. And yet Russians who have Visas and MasterCards, their cards continue to work. Because even though Visa and MasterCard are not involved anymore, the technology is in Russia because they'd forced this localization of the technology, and they allow the systems to continue to work. In China, the Chinese launched what's called CIPS, or this cross-border interbank payment system, which is their alternative to SWIFT, and it's also an alternative to something called CHIPS, the Clearinghouse Interbank Payment System, which is the American payments processing main payments processing system. The Chinese then also eventually launch a central bank digital currency, which they do in 2020. This is after Trump has now done export controls on Huawei and tariffs on China. And so they really realize that they're in the crosshairs. And I think a big motivation for the digital RMB is that it could potentially get around these intermediaries, right? If you have a digital currency, you don't have the need for these foreign exchange transactions that you and I have talked about, Paul, right? You don't have to go through a correspondent bank in New York. You can literally just do direct transactions between two digital wallets. I think that there are two other important turning points. If it's okay, then I'll turn it back over to you. Is in 2018, really it's a 2-month period, April and May of 2018, when Trump pulls out of the Iran nuclear deal unilaterally and it reimposes sanctions on Iran. He does export controls on ZTE, which is the second biggest Chinese telecommunications equipment maker. That was the first sort of big export control against China. And he imposes sanctions on the Russian aluminum company Rusal and then pulls it back. And this causes all this chaos in aluminum markets. And it's really after that that I think there's a big sort of scramble for economic security. The Russians actually, after 2018, take their foreign exchange reserves that are primarily in dollars and shift them into euros, RMB, and gold. They start settling, the Russians, their cross-border transactions primarily in euros. And so in some ways, Russia becomes the first test case of a country that is moving away from the dollar and euroizing its economy. Then, of course, Biden gets the Russians on, or gets the Europeans on board for sanctions in 2022, which I think is a critical success, frankly, that Biden had. And what then happens is the Russians move away from the euro because they no longer have access to it and start yuanizing their economy. So now Russia is the first kind of big economy that is doing most of its energy trade in RMB, most of its foreign trade in RMB, and they use the RMB as their primary foreign exchange currency.
All right, so let's go back one sentence. 20. I don't want to make this political, just purely stick with the economic. In 22, Biden convinces the European community, which is the euro, to, hey, join us, ally, join us, which then locks off Russia to the euro market, which is the second biggest market for trade and obviously very convenient for them, forces them into China. It seems to me throughout the book, whether it was military statecraft, this economic statecraft, or any of this, the importance of allies was critical. I mean, as dominant as the U.S. is, if we push, if I don't put it as a positive, if we don't include the allies, we lose something important in this global power struggle. I assume that's my takeaway from your book. Is that fair?
It is, yeah. I'll give you the reasons. I mean, the first is, I think if you look at just the differences between this 2018 moment when Trump unilaterally does these sanctions on Iran and Russia, that led to a flight away from the dollar toward the euro. The euro, by the way, is the closest analog we have to the dollar, right? It doesn't check all the boxes of the dollar, but it's much closer than the RMB, right? The euro is a freely convertible currency. You can invest the euro. You can bring it across borders. I think it's something like 20% of foreign exchange reserves are in euros. So it's about a third of the US size, where it's only like 3 or 4% that's RMB. Basically Trump, his unilateral actions inspire more countries to start using the euro. Biden, well, I think Biden could have been tougher on Russia sanctions. So I'm not universally praiseworthy of what he did. I think by virtue of getting the Europeans on board, and critically also the issuers of the other main reserve currencies like the pound and the yen, the Brits and the Japanese are also on board, you don't see this big flight away from the dollar after 2022. And in my book, I talk about how Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary at the time, is very worried about doing things like sanctioning the Central Bank of Russia because she fears it could undermine the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency. Well, the 2022 sanctions don't do that. In fact, they strengthen the dollar's role because they show that the euro, the dollar, the yen, and the pound are actually equally geopolitically risky, right? If all the reserve currency issuers are working together. I think that the thing we are risking right now, Paul, with Trump doing unilateral economic warfare, not just against Russia and China, but also Canada, Mexico, the EU, potentially everyone, right? We might get a universal tariff, is that you could see not just a flight to the RMB, but also to the other reserve currencies, right? To the euro, to the pound, to the yen, right? Because they have a lot of the advantages of the dollar. And maybe if you're less worried that Brussels is going to cut you off from their financial system, it's worth a hedge.
Um, let's talk a tad bit more about tariffs. We have a long history of tariffs. David, who teaches a terrific course at Fordham, he was saying earlier that tonight's lecture is on how Hamilton used the tariffs, a very young, fledgling country, barely could walk, very effectively. And it seems that that's very different than today. A lot of economists, most economists, believe that the planet has benefited from this global trade, but there's this huge pushback on the planet towards nationalism and populism and anti-globalization, because this is, for a lot of people, have come up with a narrative that this has been bad for it. So as countries pull in and become more national, tariffs go up. What's this world look like as we go forward?
Yeah. Look, real quick, because your point on tariffs is important. People have asked me, are tariffs a tool of economic warfare, right? Historically, at least in U.S. history, they really have not been. They've really been a tool primarily of domestic economic policy. You mentioned Hamilton, going all the way back to the early days of the American Republic. You used tariffs to raise revenue, right? Before you had a strong enough central government for an income tax, right? And this worked at the time because the U.S. had to import a lot of the things that they needed, manufactured goods from other countries. And the federal government was very small, right? So the actual financial needs to run the federal government were nothing close to what they are today. So you could actually fund the federal government through a tariff in late 1700s, early 1800s. More recently and more plausibly, you can use tariffs to protect strategic industries domestically, right? So if you say the steel industry is so important that we need steel production at home, do a steel tariff. That's what Trump has done, right? Joe Biden himself, when it became clear that Chinese electric vehicles were more globally competitive, they're just as good and much cheaper than Teslas or, Chevy Bolts or whatever, Biden put a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles because he thought it's so important for us to have domestic electric vehicle manufacturing. Those are more tools of domestic economic policy than economic warfare. What Trump has been doing is he does talk about using tariffs to raise revenue or to protect the steel industry, but more often than not, he's really talking about them as like a cudgel to get what he wants, right? To get the Mexicans to put more troops on the border and stop the flow of migrants, or to force Colombia to accept repatriation flights of migrants, or to stop countries from buying Venezuelan oil, or to coerce Canada into becoming the 51st state. That is it, using tariffs more like sanctions, right? Like a tool of economic warfare. I think the challenge is it's hard to use tariffs for all of those different objectives at once, right? You kind of have to pick one because they're often at cross purposes, right? Like if you're using tariffs as a tool of economic warfare, you got to be willing to remove the tariff if the other side does what you want them to do, right? But if you're willing to remove the tariff tomorrow, companies aren't going to start reinvesting in the United States and onshoring all of their supply chains, which would be incredibly costly. In terms of the world that it's engendering, it doesn't take someone like me to tell you this, but I mean, if you really are going for something like autarky, it'll be extremely expensive. It will be inefficient. It'll lead to slower economic growth, more inflation, and probably scarcity in some goods for some period of time. So I think economically, it's not a wise decision, at least in the short and medium term in the United States. From a geopolitical perspective, I'm a little even more worried, frankly, because if you look at history, in moments when states feel like they need to go for autarky, where they can't just buy resources from other countries, that's when they're tempted into things like territorial conquest, where, we need critical minerals from Greenland. We can't be sure that we can just buy those minerals. So maybe we need to, send the 82nd Airborne into Greenland and plant the American flag, right? That is, historically speaking, at least, when you have that mentality, it leads to more wars, right? More military conflicts and fewer economic conflicts. And so I worry not just in sort of tomorrow or 6 months from now, what this means for the U.S. economy. I worry if this mentality shifts where everything is about every nation for itself and autarky, I think we really raise the risk of great power war becoming a reality in the near future.
Yeah, that we're going to go to questions momentarily. I just want to follow that on. This magical period of the 90s, this decade, and some of the post-World War II, a lot of us grew up with that as our backdrop. I certainly grew up with that. I was a young investor at the time, and this was great. I mean, it all worked. It worked like the textbook said. It made sense. It may be the anomaly, right? We grew up with this as the norm, but if you span the focal point wider, that was the unusual period. And if we go back to this, tariffs, we don't have this global trade, lots of things, a lot of different, we're going to have more wars. And if you have more wars, you're going to have more human suffering. And it seems to me, we're not going to talk about it. We got this climate change thing that's coming, that's going to change all of this. All right. So I think now's a good time to go to questions from our audience. David, you might be on mute.
Law. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. First question comes from Will Law. What's your thoughts about Bitcoin and crypto?
Yeah. So I think that we are on the precipice of a really significant revolution in how cross-border payments happen. You heard Paul and I talk about the rise of this dollar-based financial system. I think that if you look at how the underlying technology, right? I don't know if anyone here has tried to send an international wire transfer anytime in the last few years. And it can take a week or more to settle a cross-border transaction. Using digital currencies, so not just Bitcoin, but going beyond Bitcoin to other digital currencies, these transactions can happen in a matter of seconds. So the way I look at it, sort of from my perspective as a policymaker and scholar, is that technological innovation is really hard to restrain over time. So I do think we are going to see a significant disruption in how payments happen. Do I think it will be Bitcoin that does it? I'm a little skeptical because Bitcoin is not it does not have a stable value. So it's very challenging when you have such big fluctuations in valuation over time to really invoice trade in Bitcoin. Obviously, Bitcoin transactions require an extremely high amount of energy. That's not to say Bitcoin won't survive as some speculative asset. I think it may well. But will it become the backbone of the financial system? No. What I do think might happen is you could see some combination of stable coins or central bank digital currencies disrupt the dollar-based correspondent bank system that I talked about earlier. And I think this is something that's very plausible in the next decade. And I think it's actually imperative from an American perspective that innovation is led by American companies, whether it's a digital dollar or US-backed stablecoin innovation that is guided by very strong regulatory environment.
All right. Susan Weed asked a question. It's not fully fleshed out, but I'll turn it into a question. Are there events that could re-dollarize the planet? Is there things the U.S. could do, or are there just sort of things that happen that all of a sudden it re-dollarizes, this erosion that we worry about gets reversed?
Yeah. So the answer is yes. But before I go into detail, I want to be clear that we have not yet de-dollarized, right? I think what's happening is you're seeing China and other countries build these alternative systems that exist in parallel. They're not moving over to them. I think even a great statistic that I love, I put in my book, Choke Points, China is by far the world's biggest exporter. And something like only 25 to 30% of China's own exports are invoiced in RMB. So even though China is basically they're everyone's biggest customer, China only is doing 30% of its trade in its own currency. The rest of it is basically dollars. So China does most of its cross-border trade in dollars, not RMB. So we haven't yet de-dollarized. Do I think that the U.S. can turn the tide? I think it's very hard to put the cat back in the bag and take the incentive away. I think what we can do is we can be more judicious stewards of the dollar-based financial system. That would mean using tools like sanctions and tariffs less, only using them when there's a vital national security threat. So my own view is something like Russia trying to conquer a country in Europe does raise to that threshold of weaponizing the dollar. But a backpack full of Canadian fentanyl coming into the U.S. every year does not cross that threshold. And I think that's why you're seeing significant opposition even amongst Republicans to these big tariffs on Canada. So I think part of it is judicious use of American economic weapons. And I think the other part is innovation at home, right? So I mentioned stable coins, potential digital dollar. I do think that China is ahead of us in serious financial innovation. And certainly anyone who's been to China can see that digital payments are far ahead of where they are in the US, both at the retail and wholesale levels. And I think that we need that kind of innovation here in the United States. Maybe final point too is we need to avoid shooting ourselves in the foot, because if you think about what are the fastest ways to really help these alternative infrastructures grow, it's really to do things like undermine the rule of law in the US, because I think ultimately all of this is based on the fact that investors ultimately feel comfortable that their assets in the US aren't just going to be expropriated. They're not going to be targeted for politically motivated investigations and whatnot, and also that we don't undermine the Fed's independence. I think that the Federal Reserve's role as sort of this pillar in the global financial system, the lender of last resort, has been critical. And if we start doing things like, and this might be a little too wonky, but if we start doing things like politicizing swap lines, which is something that I've heard some folks in the current Trump administration talk about, I do worry about the dollar's role in the global financial system.
So over the decades, while we've had free trade, have we really had fair trade? Let's say when China manipulates its currency, they pay their workers a pittance of what we pay. We've eroded our manufacturing base. How do you address all that? And are there answers for us?
We have not had fair trade. So I agree with Bob Lighthizer in this regard. He has a book called No Trade is Free, which is a good book, which I'd also recommend, where his view basically is that, it's we don't actually have free trade. There's always inequities baked in, right? I think that at the same time, the notion that our tariff rates should be exactly reciprocal also doesn't make any sense, because there are areas where we actually have higher tariffs on our trading partners than they have on us, because these are all based on negotiation. There are certain industries that are important to the United States domestically, like the sugar industry, where we have a lot of big tariffs, right? And others that are important to other countries. The French don't want American cheese or whatever, and I think that is okay and healthy, and it reflects the fact that we all have our own, we are a democracy and we have our own views of what's important to us. In terms of China in particular, Paul was, I think, right earlier when he said that we did kind of make a bet on China in the 90s and 2000s, which is it was okay for them to have a bit of a lopsided relationship with us, because ultimately, as China got richer, they would eventually evolve into more of a democratic, liberal country. That bet did not pay off, right? You could argue that it was a bad bet. My own view is it was probably a risk worth taking, but that we didn't reverse course soon enough. Certainly when I was in government in the 2010s, it was very clear that China was not our friend, right? I mean, they were militarizing the South China Sea. They were, sponsoring cyber attacks on the US. They stole all of our government information, including my own, right? The OPM hack that some people may forget. And we didn't really do anything to retaliate, right? We sort of allowed China to get away with it. So I actually think one of the more constructive legacies of Trump's first term is we started pushing back against China. And in some ways, this was the key legacy that also was carried forward by Biden, right? I mean, Biden in many ways was a repudiation of Trump's first term, and yet he winds up sustaining a lot of the tariffs and actually greatly expanding the export controls and other measures on China. So I think it is past time for the U.S. to sort of rebalance our trade relationship with China. What I don't think is necessary is rebalancing our trade relationship with the entire world, right? And I think the biggest own goal here is Canada and Mexico. Because again, you look at the first Trump administration, someone like Robert Lighthizer, and I'm sorry, not everyone knows who this is. He was Trump's first U.S. trade representative. He's really the architect of this shift in American trade policy. The legacy that he seems proudest of, and I've spoken to him at length for Choke Points for my book, is USMCA. It is this negotiation between Canada and Mexico that he finalized, that passed with overwhelming bipartisan majorities during Trump's first term. And Trump, right out of the gate in the second term, is violating it by putting these big tariffs on Canada and Mexico. So I think that Trump's time would be better served focusing on China and being honestly trying to bring on board our allies like the Canadians and Mexicans.
All right, this is a question that I like all the questions, but this is a question I deal with often in my life, and so I'd love to get your take. Alexander says, in the worst case scenario, when the world turns away from USD, what will be the consequence for real daily life of US people? This seems abstract. This is, who cares? What's the impact if they really started to de-dollarize?
Yeah. So I think the most important, and I'm really glad this question was asked, because I think sometimes people talk about, and even people in Trump's own administration say, oh, well, actually the dollar is not an exorbitant privilege. It's it's bad for us. We need to devalue the dollar. And to me, I view those views with a lot of skepticism, because I don't think people realize the degree to which our own political and economic model would have to be completely revolutionized if the dollar was not at the center of the global financial system. On the most basic level, we could not run giant debt every year, right? I mean, we would have to either, again, raise taxes or cut spending, or probably both, right? Because we wouldn't necessarily have an basically infinite market for U.S. treasuries, which is what the dollar gives us right now. So that would be a big change. You'd have higher taxes, and probably worse government services, which you may not think you need, but you probably do. So that would be bad. You also would have less purchasing power. So the dollar, some people say that the dollar is overvalued because of its role in the financial sector, and that there's a big demand for American assets and financial, holding dollars that is removed from demand for American exports. And what that does is it hurts our export competitiveness in certain sectors. But what it also does is it means that all of us, every single American who gets paid their salaries in dollars, has higher purchasing power. We can buy more from other countries. And so that's a good thing, right? It means that our salaries go a longer way. We have higher standard of living. I think that would be quite painful for us if all of a sudden things were more expensive. I think from a sort of very macro level, although I do think it would happen, you would see it in the data over time if the dollar loses this role, we would lose this power to do significant economic warfare, right? We wouldn't be able to do aggressive sanctions if the dollar was just another currency. And I think that would make the US less powerful geopolitically. And it would also mean that probably our best tool beyond just talking, beyond diplomacy, would be fighting, dropping bombs, sending American troops into harm's way. And so I do worry that we would go back to fighting more wars if we didn't have this outlet of economic warfare.
Michael Scarlatus wants to know, do sanctions imply that the U.S. Treasury now must keep track of anyone transacting in dollars? And would they be an example of outsourcing our foreign policy?
Yeah. So this is actually, I'm glad this was asked, because this is and I know that folks who are on the call are getting copies of Choke Point. So once you read it, send me some feedback. But one of the key, I think, key lessons of my book is that the frontline infantry in American economic wars are actually not Treasury Department officials or State Department officials. They are banks, right? They're actual bank executives, compliance officers, lawyers at banks, because if the US government actually doesn't see every single transaction in the US financial system. Banks do, right? Because all payments go through US banks. And it is actually on the banks to implement sanctions. So the US government has never frozen anyone's assets, right? It's banks who are freezing assets. It's banks who are cutting off foreign individuals and entities from the correspondent network that allows dollar clearing. And so basically what the US government is saying is that banks have this responsibility. If they violate it, if they're shown to be bad stewards of the financial system, if they do not comply with American sanctions, they face harsh penalties. And another big narrative in my book, Choke Points, is how in the 2010s, the scale of fines on banks for sanctions violations goes up by an order of magnitude, right? You start seeing something like a $9 billion fine on BNP Paribas in 2014, which wipes out their entire net income for the year. So if all of a sudden you're a bank CEO and you say, okay, well, our entire net income from the year is just wiped out, and we have all these federal officials who are in our offices staring over our desks, watching what we're doing for years, you're going to start taking this seriously. And that's why now at these average banks, you're spending over $1 billion a year on sanctions compliance. You've got 1,000+ employees just working on this. So the U.S. has successfully conscripted the financial sector to fight American economic wars.
Interesting. All right, this is a great question. Following our conversation, Richard Levin says, "What are really the effectiveness of sanctions? Russia's still in Ukraine and Crimea. Iran's still developing nuclear weapons. We could throw, South Korea. I'm sorry, North Korea is still developing the bomb. Right? Some of these bad actors seem to be on a glide path to continue to be bad actors despite pretty aggressive sanctions. Do sanctions work?
Great question. I'll pivot though and just say one thing where I was like, I think you may mention this in my intro, Paul. I was very lucky that even though I was a State Department, Treasury Department guy, the folks at the Pentagon generously took me in for a period of time to work for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Marty Dempsey. And so I got to spend some time with military officers at the highest levels. And one question I never once heard at the Pentagon was, do bombs work? Because a bomb is very effective at blowing something up, right? You drop a bomb on a building, that building's going to blow up, right? If you do really aggressive sanctions on a foreign company, that company is going to have a really hard time. May go bankrupt, right? But what a bomb can't guarantee is that you actually get what you want politically, right? And the same is true of sanctions. American sanctions, because of the dollar's role that we talked about today, are very economically painful if they're deployed with the sort of serious political will. What is much harder is taking that economic harm and translating it into an outcome that we want. With Russia, what I'll say is, there's been some impatience, I think, with the Russia sanctions, right? The big sanctions went into effect in 2022. It's only been 3 years. And already this year, the Central Bank of Russia projects zero growth. And that is alongside a benchmark interest rate at 21%, mortgage rates at 30%, inflation, which is well above 10%. So, what you're having in Russia right now is stagflation, and that's after 3 years of sanctions. The Iran sanctions, which got us the nuclear deal in 2013, really started in earnest in 2006. So that's a 7-year campaign. And no one says, oh, well, the Iran sanctions didn't work. No, hell yeah, the Iran sanctions did work, right? It takes a while. And I think that if Trump sticks to the Russia sanctions, he'll have a lot of leverage at the table with Putin. And I think part of the reason you're seeing Putin right now so desperate for a deal, spending hours and hours with Steve Witkoff and giving him oil paintings of Trump, is that he's desperate for some economic relief. And he knows that, he thinks the best way to do it is to get it from Trump.
Silvina Siriani complimented you on a fascinating presentation, then asked, could you expand on the weaponization of SWIFT, which you talked about? How much weight do the alternative systems really carry?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. I'm so glad you find the presentation interesting, and I hope you find the book just as interesting. So SWIFT is a messaging platform, right? So you think about it like banks sending encrypted messaging instructions to each other. It's almost like the WhatsApp of the banking system. If you're cut off from SWIFT, you can't send those messages. Can you still make payments? Yeah. If you can persuade the counterparty, if you're a Russian bank and you could persuade, BNP Paribas to transact with you by using a fax or picking up the phone and sharing those payment instructions, you can make that payment. And so SWIFT actually is not the most important choke point in the global economy. What tends to be the case, though, is if you're a relatively small bank, if you're not an important bank, other banks are just not going to be willing to do the labor that it would take to clear payments with you if you're not part of this SWIFT network. So I do think being part of SWIFT is important. I think more important, though, is having access to the dollar-based system. If you're cut off from the correspondent banking network, if you can't transact in dollars, you basically cannot participate in the global financial system. If you're cut off from SWIFT, but you do have access to the dollar, you still theoretically could participate in the global financial system. And we've actually seen that. There are a handful of Russian banks that are cut off from SWIFT, but they're not cut off from the dollar, including Russian Agricultural Bank, and they still can transact in the global financial system.
All right, I'm going to ask the last question. Hard to get off this call and not talk a little bit about the importance of soft power in statecraft. USAID, Voice of America, things like that. Are they a waste of money like we're being told, or are they powerful like the counterparties believe?
So I think one of the paradoxes of power, and certainly of economic warfare, is that the only way that you get power, the only reason the US has the ability to coerce anyone is because people voluntarily joined our system. They wanted to be part of the dollar-based financial system. They wanted to be part of an American-led international order. I think that if we lose that reputation, if countries start viewing America as a threat or an unreliable country, we'll see our power erode. And I think that's the lesson, just taking this full circle, of Bill Simon, right? Bill Simon's deal with the Saudis. It wasn't, price oil in dollars, reinvest in the dollar, or we'll invade you, right? It was, if you do this, we're going to give you preferential access to US treasuries. We're going to give you military assistance. It was through economic and military alliance building that we got the dollar-based financial system. So I do think that our reputation, our diplomatic power abroad is critical to underwrite our economic and military power.
I wish somebody was listening. All right, Eddie, unfortunately, we're out of time. I could talk to you for the next couple of hours. This is great. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Also want to thank everybody who attended today's lecture. Look for the digital copy of the book. Definitely don't just get it, read it. Eddie cares that you read it. He doesn't care that you get the book. All right, Eddie, thank you. This was spectacular. All right.
Thanks as well. I just want to mention we just posted our next event, April 24th, Andrew Lee, on how economics explains the world. So we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you so much.